Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry. Thank you for coming. I'm Sebastian Burka. I'm the Director of Corporate Programs at the Chicago Council. Thank you, Mr. Moscow. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. It is my pleasure to welcome our panelists for today, Gary Hofbauer, Tia Lee, Phil Levy, and Sean Donnan, to share their views on the future of trade. I'd also like to thank the Peterson Institute for International Economics for their partnership on this event. For nearly a century, the Council has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. We convene leading global voices, conduct independent research, and engage the public in the discourse on critical global issues. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent the institutional positions or views of the Council. Our spring season is in full swing, and we have several programs coming up in the near future. Tomorrow evening, actually, we have a great panel on whether we live in the Asian century, moderated by Phil Levy, actually. On January 31st, we will host Stephen Kinzer on intervention versus restraint in U.S. foreign policy. And on February 1st, we are hosting Sharif Bassiouni on Egypt in transition. We have many other programs coming up, so please check our website. To return to today's topic, according to the 2016 Chicago Council survey results, a majority of Americans believe free trade is beneficial to the U.S. economy and consumers, though the main concern for many is the threat it poses to job security. As you probably know, President Trump has recently withdrawn from the TPP and indicated plans to also renegotiate NAFTA, so I'm sure we'll hear more about that. The fate of other trade agreements as well is also uncertain. So today we look forward to an insightful conversation on the future prospects for global trade and the implications for American workers and the U.S. economy. Before we begin, please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Gary Hofbauer is the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He previously served as Maurice Greenberg Chair and Director of Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, as a professor of international finance diplomacy at Georgetown University, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Director of International Tax Staff at the U.S. Treasury. Tia Lee is Deputy Chief of Staff at the AFL-CIO, where she previously served as Policy Director and Chief International Economist. Tia also serves on the State Department Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy, where she also co-chairs the Subcommittee on Investment. She has testified before committees of the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate on various economic policy topics. Phil Levy is our Senior Fellow on the Global Economy at the Council. He previously taught at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business and was a senior economist for trade for President Bush's Council of Economic Advisors and a member of Secretary of State Rice's policy planning staff. And Sean Donnan, our moderator for today, is the World Trade Editor of the Financial Times. He previously served as the Financial Times World News Editor, Deputy World News Editor, Asia World News Editor, and Indonesia correspondent, among others. So he has also worked as a staff writer for the Associated Press and as a reporter for AFP. His work has appeared in major newspapers worldwide, including the South China Morning Post, the LA Times, and the Christian Science Monitor. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists for today.
Thank you. And thank you, Sebastian, for the reminder. I need to update that bio. It goes way back, and I feel like I've just relived my life there in just a few minutes. Thank you to the Chicago Council and the Peterson Institute for organizing this event. It is great to be here in Chicago. As I was flying in last night, I was humming "Go Cubs Go." I think, like many people, I was enthralled with the World Series last year. Then I got off the plane and I turned on my phone, and I saw that President Trump had a different view of Chicago than perhaps I was expecting. And so I want to reassure everyone here that though I've come from Washington, I am not the feds. I don't think the people up here are either. Trade is I write about globalization and trade for the Financial Times, and that used to be a kind of a dusty subject. I used to be sort of hidden away behind the library, and one of the wonderful things about the past year in this election, it has really brought it all to the fore, and I get to put people like Gary Huffbauer and Thea Lee and trade onto the front page of the Financial Times. It really is one of the issues of the moment, and that's for a very good reason. We clearly, and certainly many people would argue, we're entering a kind of new era with the arrival of Donald Trump, not just in American politics or in the use of social media, but also in terms of globalization and U.S. leadership. In fact, Martin Wolf, our chief economic commentator, is arguing forcefully that what we are seeing now is the end of Western leadership in terms of globalization, and of an era that really is the post-Second World War era in terms of globalization. I'm slightly more cautious than Martin is, but then I'm a news reporter, not a columnist, so I have to be. Clearly, we're also seeing big questions about the impact of globalization on our communities and on our domestic economies. I write for a British publication. We have gone through our own paroxysm in the last year with Brexit, and a lot of that was based on concerns over globalization, the impact of trade and immigration on communities, some of those forgotten people that Donald Trump talks about sometimes. Look, we've got a whole series of big questions here. We're just going to kick off with a quick back and forth here on stage. We will then turn to you in the audience. We will expect smart, educated questions from you. We'll also ask you to introduce yourself, if you can, before you pose your question. Gary, you've been watching this stuff for a long time, and I thought we'd start with you first of all. And just get an idea of we're here talking about the future of trade, and so let's start with that idea. We've seen this week President Trump pulling out of TPP. Today in Washington, 2 Mexican ministers have landed to start the process of talking about renegotiating NAFTA, among other things. We'll see President Peña Nieto in town next week. Clearly, there's been a rapid start on that end of things. But beyond that, what should we expect? What do you expect from the Trump administration in terms of trade policy? And how scared should we be?
Very. This marks the end of policy liberalization, at least for 4 years, maybe longer. We wrote a book at the Institute titled Globalization at Risk about 4 or 5 years ago, and the risk is here. The risk has happened. There is no meaningful policy liberalization on the horizon. And there is a lot of pressure to unwind. So all you have to do is look at Trump's slogan, and he has hired somebody to implement the slogan, "Hire America, buy American." Well, that's the formula for national procurement that every leader in the world will, I guess, take the song from. So we'll have, hire Canadians, buy Canadian, etc. This is a period when the best we can expect going forward is that trade grows as fast as world gross domestic product, which is going to be about 3 to 4%. That's the best. We're not going to go back to the 5-6% growth of trade while GDP was growing at 3 or 4%, and we might do worse than that. So it's hard to be optimistic. The only place you can be moderately optimistic about in terms of dynamism from world trade is the digital space, and that's growing very fast. The Chinese are doing their best to limit it. Others may learn from China and restrict it. But if I can just part on one shot to my old sparring partner here, Thea Lee. Thea Lee's great dream has finally come true. We are not going to have NAFTA anymore. I think that word will be retired. The substance may stay, but NAFTA became a 5-letter word, and it will go.
Okay, well, Thea, he set you up there. But you, I mean, one of the fascinating things for me this week has been on Monday watching the business leaders march in the morning and the labor leaders come in the afternoon for a meeting. Clear political theater there in terms of reaching out to both the managers and the workers there. But you also are coming from the position of an organization that campaigned vigorously against Donald Trump during the campaign last year and saw him do very well in some of your kind of heartland areas and among your core constituencies. So I wonder how what we're seeing now looks like from where you're sitting.
Well, it's a complicated question,
Yep.
as you can imagine, Sean, and I would say, all of my dreams have not come true. And to be honest, this is a tough moment for the labor movement because Donald Trump was not our candidate, as you said. We did not endorse him, and we have a lot of concerns, and we still have a lot of concerns with his overall approach and his overall economic narrative, even on trade, where we do agree with him that the TPP was a bad trade agreement. We do agree that NAFTA needs to be renegotiated. Even on trade, we've been critics of U.S. trade policy for a couple of decades now. Me personally, for about 25 years. Gary and I have been on the circuit for quite a long time. But our critique of trade is not that we should turn our backs on the rest of the world or put America first or quit trading. Our critique has always been that we need a different set of rules in the global economy, a set of rules that are good for workers, good for the environment, good for consumers, but good not just for American workers, but for Mexican workers and Canadian workers and Chinese workers and Bangladeshi workers. And that's why we've fought so hard to ensure that there are workers' rights, international workers' rights, ILO, core labor standards included in our trade agreements, and we fight every day to enforce those. So our vision is different from Donald Trump's, and I just want to be crystal clear about that because we don't see the world the same way. Are we going to be able to, we will give advice to Donald Trump as we give advice to every president. We will certainly meet and we will work on the issues that our members care a lot about. But our members, it's also important to remember, are not just white men in the Midwest. Our members are every race. They're native born, they're immigrants, they're women, they're men, they're of every race. And so, one of our first goals in this presidency is to make sure that all of our members feel safe and protected. And what does that mean in the context of trade policy? Well, Donald Trump found a vulnerability and he exploited it. And he did so very successfully. And we're glad that the TPP is not going to become reality. We thought that was a deeply, deeply flawed trade agreement. We had given a lot of advice to the Obama administration about how it could have been better. Get rid of the investor-state dispute settlement, strengthen the labor and environment chapters, strengthen the rule of origin, deal with procurement differently. We had a big stack of very concrete, very constructive suggestions,
yeah.
And they were ignored. And so, our view is that both Democrats and Republicans have left this opening for somebody like Donald Trump to exploit. What we want to do, and we're going to keep doing, is to put forward our vision of a progressive global economy, which is one where workers' rights are respected, whatever country you're in, and that sometimes that we use trade agreements to enforce and protect workers, and climate change. We do want to be able to not have trade rules be the enemy of international climate protections and so on. So that's going to be our goal. We're going to keep doing that. It doesn't really matter who's in the White House. We always have to fight. We're going to be fighting now.
Yeah, but the fight has changed.
The fight has changed very dramatically.
Yeah. Phil, you have worked, as we just heard, in a Republican White House on trade. This looks a little different. For your party, I'm just wondering, sort of been thinking a little bit about the Republican Party on trade. In some ways, it looks like an opposition party up there in Congress, traditionally, although they have their man in the White House. So just from a Republican perspective, just walk me through how you read what we're seeing now and where you think it's going to go.
Well, I think I'm not quite ready to throw in the towel the way Gary was. I think some of the early signs are disturbing. You're right; they run counter to what have traditionally been Republican stances in favor of sort of open markets and the U.S. being a leader on the global stage on these things. I would note that we do have a history of presidents saying one thing on the campaign trail and even maybe in early days in office and then doing something else. So
President Obama called for the renegotiation of NAFTA when he ran in 2008. Yeah.
he had 3 signed agreements waiting for him that he said, I'm not going to move forward with. And
Right.
it ended up taking, with Colombia, Panama, and Korea, that ended up taking years until there were little cosmetic changes. And then he felt that he could do so. So we'll see how this all plays out. But I think you're right, there is a tension now. It's interesting as we watch the early days of this administration that one of the things that is striking when you're in the White House is how careful and deliberative the normal process of informing a president is. And that's not a Republican thing, that was true for Democrats as well, that you usually bring in, you've got a lot of different constituencies. You want to hear from the labor community, you want to hear from the business community, what economists say, what lawyers say, what are the political ramifications. What's interesting is that we're seeing a lot of these things taking place now when you don't have that apparatus in place yet, where you don't, forget cabinet secretaries, they're important, but often this is the work of assistant secretaries and undersecretaries who are saying, if you do this, this is what will happen. And so to me, one of the more concerning things is that there's an element of charging ahead before the president is getting fully informed on what the ramifications may be.
Right. There's only one member of his trade team who's in place right now, and that's Peter Navarro at this new National Trade Council, arguably not likely to be the most senior player on trade in when everyone gets in place. Wilbur Ross at Commerce and Bob Lighthizer at USTR and so on.
Well, and that's what makes this a little bit hard to read, because you're right, we've got this new trade council, which seems somewhat duplicative of having, say, a National Economic Council, which also used to be a way that things came up, plus you've got the U.S. trade rep. So often when you look at an administration, you say, who's going to reign supreme? Clearly the president sits atop, but among staff, and what does that signal for where they're going to go? What we've seen so far is a lot of duplication with people who seem to often have very different views.
Yeah. I mean, I had someone from a recently outgoing administration say to me that they had been talking to some of the successors come in, and they'd had at least 5 different people tell them that they were going to be in charge of trade policy, which was...
one of them might be right.
Gary, let's talk economics for a little bit here. I mean, one of the things that Donald Trump is the trade agenda is wrapped up in this bigger agenda on jobs and bringing back manufacturing, boosting growth in the U.S. economy. They think they can get growth back to 3-4%. And so I wonder if there's a tension at all in terms of trade policy versus what we're seeing in terms of looser fiscal policy, tax cuts, deregulation, infrastructure spending, and so on, and how that's going to play into debate.
There's tremendous tension. It'll be great to watch this unfold, because Trump's view of trade agreements is that that the U.S. wins if we have a trade agreement with a country that has a trade deficit with us. So we've won against Australia and a handful of other countries, but we've lost against Germany, Mexico, China, Korea, Japan, whatever. Lose, lose, lose. So his view is that trade deficits are your measure of have you won or lost, and basically the U.S. has lost. So, he'll try to have agreements which somehow narrow the deficit. Most macroeconomists, and I think most economists would say that's he can't deliver on that, but he can try. Meanwhile, he's going to have a big tax cut if he can work with the Republicans in Congress, and you'll have big infrastructure spending if he can work out with all the Congress, because they all have different views how to spend on infrastructure. And this almost certainly means this is how he will deliver jobs, not through the trade agreements, but maybe through the spending and the enlargement of the fiscal deficit, which is already about 3.5% of GDP, but it can go larger. And that will almost certainly mean that the trade deficit goes up, no matter what agreement he does with Mexico or China or whatever. So you've got the macro policy is going to deliver higher trade deficits if it succeeds on the job front, which is his probably number one goal. And the trade agreements are, be some sort of pickup on this. So there is tremendous tension there. Maybe we just go for the photo op, though, the photo op approach to trade policy. We've already done that with job owning on some of these CEOs. And the next thing is we can stop some import from Mexico, and there'll be some factory which opens up and the president goes out and says, look at 100 jobs right there, smiling faces. So that could end up being kind of the reality of trade policy as opposed to actually cutting the trade deficit through trade agreements.
Thea, you've got a different take on trade deficits.
Well, I do, and actually Gary has a little bit of a different take too. I mean, back during the NAFTA debate, it was Gary and Jeff Schott's book where, you know, admittedly, the bilateral trade deficit is a rough measure of, you know, who's winning and losing between two countries, but that was the basis for, you know, the job projections that NAFTA was going to create 200,000 jobs in the United States. It was the basis for, you know, USA NAFTA and Bill Clinton and everybody else who talked about NAFTA as a job winner was because we were going to run a trade surplus with Mexico for 9 or 12 years, which didn't happen. Of course, it turned, our small surplus with Mexico turned to a deficit in the first year, right before the peso crisis. But I think the trade deficit is not irrelevant. You know, the United States runs a $500 and some odd billion trade deficit, and that is a measure of how we are not engaging in the global economy in a way that is actually supporting and nurturing GDP or good jobs, because we are importing $500 billion more worth of goods and services than we are exporting. And that's an issue, and it's particularly an issue with respect to China. And so Donald Trump is not wrong that our trade policy with respect to China has not been good for American workers or for US-based businesses. And so he's not wrong to raise that as a concern. How do we fix it? That's a different question. And I think, you know, the interplay of the macroeconomic policy and the fiscal policy and the trade policy is going to be very confusing because there are a lot of different mixed signals coming out of this administration. One thing, you know, in terms of the narrative, another place where labor movement would disagree with Donald Trump is, you know, if you talk about why is the U.S. not competitive in the global economy, he's talked about, you know, our taxes are too high, our regulations are too high, and our wages are too high. That's not how we see the world. We haven't invested enough in infrastructure. We haven't invested enough in skills. We need to do that. We need to build up, and we need a trade policy that doesn't actually reward and accelerate outsourcing. So that's a different, but on the day one, the same day that he issued the TPP executive order, he also froze federal hiring, which doesn't make sense if he's going to enforce our trade laws better. Over at the Commerce Department right now, there are 100 vacancies in the Enforcement and Compliance Division. How are we going to crack down on unfair trade practices if we don't have any people at the Commerce Department to carry out that job? In terms of regulation, he's going to cut 75% of our regulations. Those are the regulations that keep our water clean and our air clean and our food safe and our toys safe and so on. That's a really misguided view of what we need to do in terms of making the United States more competitive. There's a difference between putting America first if America is, you know, billionaires and American companies and multinational corporations, or America is actually working people.
Yeah. We've been running here in the U.S. a trade deficit since the 1970s, haven't we? I mean, Phil, I mean, I think that's another, and I sometimes think back to myself and I think of the car, my first car, which was a 1975 Chevy Nova, and was a fine automobile, but it's not something I would want my children to drive. Right. And I think to the cars that we drive today, and the amount of progress and so on. And I clearly think of competition from foreign makers as part of that, and so on. But Phil, you wanted to jump in on that.
Well, I was going to say, first, I'm always happy when I can find areas of agreement with Thea. It's not going to be on trade deficits. The federal hiring thing, I agree with you. That's just bad policy. On trade deficits, I would take quite a different stance. And it's important that we make a distinction here between bilateral trade balances and where we are overall, the country's overall trade deficit. From an economic standpoint, the bilateral really is meaningless. It's not a measure of how well we're doing. And just as one illustration, Thea brought up the China example. Part of this is because we don't measure what we want to measure, which is value added. We measure sort of gross flows. So if you take a good that used to be 100% made in Malaysia, and now instead you do that final finishing touch, the last 5% in China, all of a sudden our trade deficit with China has shot up because everything, all 100% gets attributed to China. So the bilateral stuff is very misleading.
Yeah.
But some of the goods are made in China and then finished in Malaysia. So it goes both ways.
No,
It doesn't completely undercut.
It goes both ways, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all a wash. In fact, I think
But
most of the
the
evidence
striking
is that
thing
it's
is how
not.
complicated it is to compute this. The OECD does really good work on it, and it's about 5 years behind.
It's right. It's
you know,
hard.
in terms of the actual position, and that shows a very different. And the example that often is used is the iPhone, right? Where,
Yeah, that's right.
Where you know who in the supply chain or in the value chain extracts the most value out of an iPhone. Probably Apple rather than Foxconn.
Right.
You know?
It is funny because both sides tend to use that as an example. The U.S. looks and says, here's our great innovation.
Yeah.
Why is it made in China? And the Chinese say, we're making this thing. Why are you guys getting all the returns?
Yeah.
And why don't we have brands and the like? I think if you turn to overall deficits, I'm with Gary on this one, that this is where you have this conflict, that as you say, we've been running deficits for a very long time, both with sort of high rates of unemployment and low rates of unemployment. It doesn't correlate very well. In fact, if you do the correlation, it's often when we have higher deficits that we're doing better. And in part that's because when the economy booms, we demand more of everything, including imports. And so that's what we mean when we sort of talk about a macroeconomic driver, and it's exactly that tension. That if you're trying to stoke the economy and do well, among other things, we think that's going to mean consumption of imports will go up.
And then there's the dollar.
And there's
you
the
know,
dollar.
Which the president has already said that the dollar is too strong, departing from past practices. But there's also, underlying all this is a discussion, and Thea, you and I were talking about this as we were trying to race through our lunch there earlier, but there's this big debate about the shape of the U.S. economy, really. I mean, this is a services-driven economy now. Manufacturing employment is now less than 10% of the workforce. It is, and when we talk about manufacturing and bringing jobs back, very quickly a lot of economists will point out that most of the jobs that were lost in the last 10 or 20 years were lost to automation rather than trade or globalization. And in fact, if you look at industrial output, manufacturing output for the US, it's going gangbusters. I mean, we're back up to record levels in terms of actual output of goods here. Thea, since we were talking about it at lunch, why don't you, that interplay between automation and trade and who we should blame for these jobs and how you bring them back.
I think we can stipulate that both automation, both productivity growth, technology, and trade are contributors to job loss. And sometimes they're self-reinforcing, that, if you're under competition from imports, you might choose to automate more. And, so all those things are at play. But I think one of the questions is, where are the policy levers that we control? And I think we have more control over trade policy. And it's not just, and I just really want to emphasize this, because I feel like for 25 years I've been saying it and nobody ever hears it. It's not whether we trade. It's how we trade and what the rules are and who they benefit. And the problem with TPP wasn't that we were trading with those particular countries. It was that this was really a misguided trade policy of giving corporations the right to sue governments with the investor-state dispute settlement. Very controversial, and I would argue a really failed policy and an undemocratic policy. And sort of how we add up, you take the 1,000 pages that go into most trade agreements, and you look at which pieces are for corporations to help them move jobs overseas and protect their profits when they do so, and how much are for actually exports. And there's a big difference there. So I think we just have to be really clear what we're talking about, that I'm not the anti-globalization girl. I don't want to stop trade. I want to trade differently. I think the United States of America can be a great force for good. It should be a part of the global economy. We should be trading with developing countries as well as industrialized countries. We should be making sure that when we do so, our companies are not taking advantage of trade and trade agreements to treat workers in other countries badly so they can produce cheaply and bring the goods back into the United States and displace American workers. So, it's very different. Gary talked at the beginning about trade, the end of policy liberalization. I think some of this is a little ominous, a little bit doomsday, that I don't think that the measures we should be looking at are the volume of trade. I don't think anybody gives a hoot about how much trade there is, or even like what the tariff levels are. It's, how are we engaged in the global economy? What are our priorities? What are the messages we are sending to our trading partners about what we value? Do we value democracy and human rights and environmentally sound measures and safe products, or do we value corporate profits? and the pharmaceutical companies, and them being able to get a huge profit from people in poor countries who are desperately trying to get access to medicines. So I think our trade policy has been upside down, and if this moment in time is an opportunity for us to reset that trade policy, that's a good thing.
Can I get a few licks in here?
She got a few in there.
Yeah, she did. She's very good at that. Okay, the way, if you listen to Thea, trade and automation, it's about the same. That is just not the fact. When I was a kid, about 30% of the workforce was in manufacturing. Our labor force today is about 150 million people. I'm going to round the numbers for simplicity. If we had 30% today, if we didn't have the automation, everything we've done in the last 50 years in my lifetime, 60 years, since I was a kid, we would have about 45 million people in manufacturing today. 30% of 150, 45 million. We have 12.5 million. If we got rid of the trade deficit, which is one of Thea's great goals, and she shares that with Donald Trump, we would have 500 billion more worth of jobs. The multiplier here, I'm sorry to go through this arithmetic, but the multiplier is about 5,000 jobs per $1 billion. So 5,000 jobs times 500 billion is 2.5 million. So yes, by some magic, I didn't interrupt you, by some magic of exchange rates, border tax adjustments, trade protection and so forth, maybe we could collapse that trade deficit to zero. I think it's unlikely. And have 2.5 million more jobs. So instead of 12.5 million in manufacturing, let's suppose they all went to manufacturing, you'd have 15 million. That's against the 45 million, which was the start of my arithmetic. Where did the other 30 million go? That was automation, and there's going to be more of that. So it's not that they're about the same. Automation is the big driver of dislocation. That's Schumpeter all over again. And that's the big driver of prosperity in this country. But you can't get prosperity without dislocation. So to say they're equal or even approximately the same is just a total misjudgment, and it's a misinformation to the American worker who thinks somehow that Donald Trump, through his trade agreements, is going to bring the jobs back to those battleground states.
Thea, quickly, and then I want to move on beyond trade deficits at some point.
Well, there's actually a lot of research about trying to unpack the causes of wage inequality, the growth in wage inequality over the last couple of decades. And, I think the results show productivity and technology is probably the largest. I'm going to concede that. And that trade and globalization is not far behind in terms of the impact. So if it's, let's say it's 25% of the growth in wage inequality, the truth is we've had a lot of growth in wage inequality over the last 3 decades. And so if trade policy is one of the things that we have a lever on, that we control a little bit, and we can mitigate the growth in inequality. And this is, I think it's also a really important point, because where we are in history is that our trade barriers are actually very low, around 2.5% for the United States of America. When you take the economic analysis of the trade agreements, prospective or past, the gains from trade, from those trade agreements, are actually minuscule. Around 12%, I think, in TPP, around 5% for the TTIP. Most of the changes are coming from regulatory changes or from investment. But here's the basic point I want to make. The basic point is that productivity growth is great. Technology is important. Nobody wants to live in a world without productivity growth and without technology. But over the last couple of decades, the reason we like productivity growth is not for itself, not to see the number on paper. It's because that is the basis for non-inflationary wage growth. That the whole point is to raise living standards for people. I think most people would agree that that's why this is a good thing. It's a healthy thing for an economy. Every economy needs it. And yet in the last 3 decades, we've had tremendous productivity growth. We've had economic growth. We've had a lot of globalization. And real wages for most American workers, the median worker in the United States economy, has stagnated. So workers have not gotten, and part of it is, and this is actually the punchline, is that it is about bargaining power. And so I think Gary's simplistic breakdown of productivity versus trade misses one of the big dynamics, which is that part of the impact of trade on American workers is not just the number of jobs that go overseas through the trade deficit, but it is how the bargaining relationship between American workers and American companies has shifted over years, where workers have lost their bargaining power and corporations have gained, because their mobility and their flexibility that comes partly from globalization, partly from innovation, has been used to bust unions, to deregulate, to privatize, and to move jobs offshore.
I think that, I think what's fascinating to me, and always, and this happens every time I sit down and talk about this with folks, is that we often forget our recent history. We had a huge global financial crisis in 2008 and an economic crisis that came out of it. And if you look at the wage numbers in 2007 versus the wage numbers today, there was a huge impact in 09 and 10 that clearly upended a lot of these long-term trends. And that applies to trade, to growth, to manufacturing employment. It was actually manufacturing employment was coming back before the crisis, right? And then took a huge dive in 09 and so on. But let's move on to the future. So Gary, you've talked about the end of liberalization, which is slightly less scary than what a lot of people are worried about, which is the advent of a trade war. Or the beginning of an era of protectionism, of hard protectionism, the erection of tariffs, and so on. How likely is it that we end up in a trade war? And I'm going to go to Phil first on this one.
Sure.
I think it's a real danger. I mean, if all of the rhetoric that our new president has put forward comes into play, then it's a very real danger. I think the trading system that's under threat, agreements, one of the things that agreements such as NAFTA or the World Trade Organization do is they've kept trade agreements from spiraling, or trade disagreements from spiraling out of control. And so that's the thing that one has to watch for and be wary. We've had trade disagreements over the decades. President Obama has slapped tire tariffs on the Chinese. Gary has studied this. The Chinese decided they took a dislike to American poultry, and then that's it, right? You do that and it stops. The worry is if you get very heated rhetoric around this and there's retaliation for the retaliation, then you can see an unwinding. And one of the things that's behind what we've been discussing so far is the global economy has sort of changed in its nature, whereas we now have global supply chains. And so there is a danger that you could really affect the competitiveness of American companies and the American economy if you start throwing a wrench in.
And we saw part of the impact after the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, right? Or the floods in Thailand, where all of a sudden you had global supply chains really grind to a halt because
it's a great
single factory went down in Japan.
That's right. It's a great example because it runs contrary to what we might have thought. We might have thought, the Japanese compete with us in autos, for example, so we wouldn't wish that upon them, but if they have a disaster, then that, and in fact, as you said, American factories shut down, and that's the different world that's built around global supply chains.
Gary, quickly?
Yeah, we are a country of checks and balances. And one of the checks, which is not in the Constitution, is the financial markets. A trade war, I very strongly believe, will lead to a collapse in Wall Street. A big collapse, because half of American profits of the S&P 500, the ones that Thea excoriates, come from abroad. And you get this kind of trade war, and you wonder, what are the prospects of America? And I think Trump has wisely chosen a lot of financial types for his advisors. Gary Cohn, Mnuchin, possibly Kudlow will be there. Wilbur Ross himself has a big role in finance. These people will tell him, well, he already knows, tell him, you go in that direction, you get a trade war going with China, a real trade war, much larger than the escalation that, the small level escalation that Phil was talking about. And, goodbye to this wonderful smiling stock market.
Yeah.
Well, I don't pretend to know what the Trump administration will do on this front, but I think I think that what Phil said is probably right, that we don't need to get completely alarmist at this particular point in time, because there are a lot of things that the Trump administration could do in terms of dealing with currency manipulation, being more aggressive in enforcing our trade laws, that will not start a trade war, that will simply, put other countries on notice that we are going to be more aggressive about enforcing our trade laws and addressing problems, real problems
Right.
for the U.S. economy, like currency manipulation. That's not the same thing as a trade war. Does it go further? I don't know.
Why don't we turn to the floor? We've been monopolizing the conversation up here. If you can just put your hand up if you've got a question. There's some mics coming around. Wait for the mic and make sure you introduce yourself to the folks around you. Why don't we start over here? He had his hand up first.
All right.
Yeah.
My name's Fred Hess. I work for CPS here in the city, and I was curious about artificial intelligence in the future of trade and the workplace.
Okay, we're going to take these why don't we take a group of 3 questions here? It's right here in the middle.
Hi, my name is Rich Carr. I wanted to ask more about trade. We talked about trade deficits. What about our surplus on services? What about capital flows in investments?
Okay.
What's the importance of that?
Okay,
Please.
and then there was one more in the same row just over there on the left. It's coming to you from the other side.
Hi, I'm Maji Thorpe from City Colleges of Chicago. Let's just say everything works according to Trump's dream and all these businesses come flooding back with great jobs that we as Americans love to have back here. Do you believe that he's going to see it as a priority to invest in the infrastructure to actually get workers to those jobs? Or do you think he believes that if they are the jobs are rebuilt, the workers will come?
Okay, so we've got artificial intelligence, capital flows, and infrastructure. Who wants to go first? Phil,
I
you
can
want-
take a stab at things.
Yeah.
On artificial intelligence, I guess I would say this is part of the trend that Gary described very well, to where you're seeing real technological advance, and it doesn't eliminate work, but it changes the nature of work, and it changes the rewards to different kinds of skills. That now it's not necessarily somebody who can move something across the factory floor. It's somebody who can program the device that will then move across the factory floor. So I think it's an element of these things. I want to pick up, I'll leave some stuff to others, but on the infrastructure point, I think maybe the hopeful take, and I'm not going to speak for Republicans everywhere, but a hopeful take, which you've heard from some on Capitol Hill, is take the general desire to have better jobs and to make for a better business climate. Hopefully it remains mostly as rhetoric on the trade front, but you see infrastructure, you see tax reform, you see some of these other measures which really do improve the business climate. So in an ideal world, you're getting more of that and less of the protections. I don't think the protections are going to pay off the way they hope.
Thea?
I want to weigh in on the infrastructure question because I think this is really important, and this is something, it's been an enormous priority both for the AFL-CIO and for the business community. The Chamber of Commerce has worked with us for many, many years, and I'd say it's a huge frustration. The Republicans in Congress know perfectly well that this infrastructure investment is long overdue, and yet they blocked President Obama from taking any meaningful measures on infrastructure for 8 years, and that's really, I think, regrettable. Now, maybe they're willing to, because we all know that Republicans in Congress care about the deficit when there's a Democrat in the office, but not when there's a Republican in the office. So the fiscal responsibility concerns kind of less important right now. But there are definitely some good signs here. The Senate Democrats just yesterday introduced $1 trillion bill for infrastructure over 5 years, and we're all in on infrastructure. And if President Trump is serious about those plans, I think this is something where we definitely we need the investments and we need the jobs, and the economy can handle it in terms of the spending. I think we shouldn't fool ourselves, because I think how this gets funded is going to be important. That the idea that this is all funded through tax breaks or through user fees is a fiction. There's real things that need to happen. Some of them will generate some revenues, but not to the extent that's needed. We're going to need to spend some money as a country. This is long overdue. I think it's the American Society of Civil Engineers says we have a $3 trillion infrastructure deficit. That's just fixing the stuff we have. That's not even getting to the next century in terms of smart grid and high-speed rail.
I mean, striking, just remember right after the election, a member of the Freedom Caucus, this is the hard right of the Republican Party in the House, being interviewed by someone and overhearing this and made the point that, I mean, in the campaign, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump put infrastructure at the kind of heart of their economic message. Both of them had a plan that was roughly $1 trillion in size, and this member of the Freedom Caucus said yes, but her plan was a spending plan. His plan is a growth plan. And they were both essentially roughly about the same time, which tells you about spin and politics. Gary, on the deficit and capital flows, on the deficit and capital flows.
I like the question about services because this is forgotten by Trump, even though he's in the service business. Hotels, what else is that but services? But he never mentioned that the U.S. has a services surplus of about $250 billion a year, and it is a very strong comparative advantage of the United States to open services markets. And when people talk about our low tariffs, well, they are low across manufactured goods. On services, the tariff equivalent of barriers, even in the United States, is very high, probably averaging 30%, and in other countries, much higher, 50% and higher in China, Japan, Korea, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of barriers to services. There's a huge potential market, export market for the United States, and got zero attention in the campaign, maybe in the governance. It will get some attention. So that's a very good point. And obviously the capital flows, as Phil said right at the beginning, they balance out the trade deficits, and the U.S. is a very attractive place for capital, and maybe even too attractive a place for capital, and that helps drive up the deficits through the mechanism of the strong dollar. So as we go forward on that, on the negotiations, opening foreign services markets, and that even means the Canadian market, that even means the Mexican market, because while they're quite generally open to goods, they're not quite as open, nor is ours, to services, and there's a big potential advantage for the United States.
Should we go to another round of questions just here quickly? I know there was a question in the front here that I was expecting on one of my favorite subjects. So why don't we start there, and then we'll go back and.
Right there.
My question is, and I'm sort of thinking about, Gary, your math, and the 45 million, and then and the 30, and the 15, 10 to 15 anyway. And my question is, how does the border adjustment tax reform concept that seems to be gaining momentum impact that math? How order of magnitude, how important is it? And which is the chicken and which is the egg? And how's it going to be sort of synthesized or actualized? Because it's pretty complicated when you take into consideration currencies, capital flows, now tax reform and so forth. So I'm fuzzy on the whole thing. It'd be helpful to get a perspective.
And well, just while the mic's moving over here there was one question back there, was there? And just put your hand up, right back there. And just a second, how many people here know what the border adjustability tax proposal is? Put your hands up high. Yeah, okay, so we've got about a third of the room. So perhaps, I mean, loosely, it's an idea that the House Republicans have proposed that you would move to a system of business taxation where one of the things is that you would tax imports and effectively exports would be tax-free. The question there.
Oh, sure. So if you listen to Donald Trump, it sounds like the sort of things he wants to do on trade might be to slap tariffs on particular countries like China and Mexico, and maybe, you go down the list, Japan, Germany maybe, or slap tariffs somehow on particular companies if they move jobs overseas. So assuming that, taking him at his word that that's what he wants to do and that's actually a high priority for him, given the institutional constraints in place and the people in positions of power, what do you think, what does the policy end up actually looking like? Can he actually get any of this done, and what does he get done?
You got the world's leading expert on that right here. And there was another question here in the front.
It was sort of the same question, based on that, what he can do.
Right.
And the second question is, I'm sorry, Laura Ortega with the Illinois Chamber of Commerce, what he can do and what he will end up doing and how sustainable this sort of ad hoc modus operandum.
Okay. And then there was another, we'll wrap up here with the question at the front, just because she's sitting in the front row.
Well, thank you. Julie Steffen-Leder with Jones Lang LaSalle and part of the emerging leaders of this year as well with the council. My question is really, and not trying to move away from the future of trade, but is there maybe a lack of, let's say, preparing workers as well?
Okay.
Trade is going to happen. There is a lot about maybe is there a lack of re-education, of providing alternatives, because in the end these jobs are very likely not coming back.
Okay, good point. Who wants to take on border adjustability, first of all? Gary?
Well, I just love that subject because I've worked on it for 30 years, so what the heck when it comes back, we're always happy about it. Let me do a little bit of arithmetic first and then not get too deep in the weeds. The House plan talks about a 20% border adjustment. That would be a 20% tax on imports and exports would be excluded. The arithmetic we favor at the Institute would say that if you change the exchange rate by 10%, you reduce the current account deficit, let's say loosely the trade deficit, by 1% of GDP. So on round numbers, 10% on the exchange rate does 200 billion on the trade deficit. Cut it from 500 to 300 on the exchange rate. This is 20%. So the math would suggest you could get up to 400 billion reduction. That would be a big decline in trade deficit from 500 to 400. But here's the ringer in this whole story. There is deep division in the economics profession and deep division in the Peterson Institute. I don't know about the Global Council here, Chicago Council, but between those who think that the exchange rate, the dollar, will move exactly, let's not say exactly, but will almost entirely offset whatever the border tax adjustment is. So the dollar would go up by 20%. If you're in that school where you've got the good company of Feldstein, Marty Feldstein, and Alan Auerbach and Douglas Holtz-Eakin, you say there's no effect on the trade balance because the exchange rate wipes it out. That's school one. School two doesn't go to the extreme, but it says that there will be largely an impact on the trade balance. So that maybe the dollar goes up, but not 20%, maybe 5%. In which case, you would get a big shrink in the trade balance if, this is now, I know there are a lot of ifs here, if there's enough capacity in the American economy to, produce, let's say, another $300, $400 billion worth of goods and services without running into inflation. And that's another big debate. So the question is as to how much you would do on the trade deficit is completely at two extremes in terms of the outcome.
But there's also, the impact on importers and retailers are fighting this.
Yeah,
we're thinking of, in Washington, we're getting ready for the mother of all business rumbles, which is Walmart against GE.
Oh, this is good for K Street. Good for K Street.
Washington.
That's where all these lawyers are.
Yeah.
Good for K Street, lawyers and lobbyists, because the proponents say they go with Auerbach and Feldstein. You're not going to be hurt because the exchange rate is going to take care of the pain. The opponents say, that's not money in my pocket, that's money out of my pocket. And they very strongly oppose it.
Well, just in terms of the border tax adjustment, I haven't really studied this particular proposal, but it is true that most of our trading partners have a value-added tax, which, does get imposed on imports and rebated on exports. And so, there is it's not totally ridiculous to think that we ought to at least have something in our tax code which offsets the fact that Germany or China or other countries are are putting, let's say, a 17% tax
Right.
on American cars going into Germany and giving German cars coming into the United States a 17% rebate. So because we have a different tax system, I would say that that has been disadvantageous to the United States. Whether this
Yeah.
particular proposal is the right way to fix it, I'm not sure yet.
Since you've got the mic, Thea, just on getting workers ready for the 21st century, I mean,
Yeah. Well, thank you, Julie, for the question. And, absolutely, we ought to be doing more as a country to retrain workers. At every level, there should be lifelong learning. I think most industrialized countries spend a much, much larger percentage of GDP on training than the United States does. And I would say that's a fault of both the U.S. government and of business, that there has been an underinvestment in American workforce skills, workforce development. The AFL-CIO, actually, people probably don't know, but the labor movement is the second biggest trainer of workers in the United States after the military. Through our apprenticeship programs, the building trades, but also in the AFL-CIO right now, did get some funding from the Labor Department under the Obama administration to do some apprenticeship work in high-tech manufacturing and also in the hospitality industry. And we're doing that around the country in 8 different states. We'd love to get more funding to do more of that, but it's been a challenge. But I also think it's important that this is not the entire solution to the problem that we've raised. And it's something that I think every civilized nation and industrialized nation needs to do, is to invest in skills. But I think this issue often gets misused by the business community as an excuse for either bringing in temporary workers from overseas or of outsourcing. And so it's important that we make the real distinction there.
this is also, I mean, one of the points that defenders of trade make is that also this is where the issue is domestic policy, not trade policy per se. It's education policy and so on. Just quickly, Gary, since you are, in my mind, the world's leading expert on this, how much can Donald Trump really do in terms of delivering on his tariff promise? And there is, if you Google Gary Huffbauer, Peterson Institute, what can Donald Trump do? You'll find his fantastic paper, which kind of briefs you on all the statutes that you can do there.
Well, you want to think about the constraints, as somebody in another question asked. And the point of that paper that Sean quite very pleasantly advertised is that there are very few, if any, judicial restraints. That is, if he does what he's talking about doing, it'll be very hard for a company to go to court and get an injunction, a preliminary injunction, or a permanent injunction against him doing that, because we have a load of statutes, about 8 statutes over the last 100 years, which delegate all sorts of power to a president to restrict, not to liberalize, but to restrict international commerce. So the judicial restraint is very far removed. I think it only would come into play if he actually named a company, a particular company, Toyota, and said, well, you, Toyota, anything you import gets an extra bonus 25% tariff. That, I think, runs into equal protection problems. But he could do almost the same thing by identifying Toyota products and putting high tariffs on their 8-digit or 10-digit or 12-digit products as they're imported. There is another constraint which is equally important, or which is more relevant, and that is the Congress. Now, the Congress, or past Congresses, have given all this power to the president, but they would be very peeved. Many congressmen would be very peeved if he actually used it without both consulting them and getting their assent. Even though they might like what he did, they want to be consulted. They want to have their input. And so that is a real constraint, because to get through the rest of his agenda, he needs the cooperation. He has a very narrow margin. He only has to lose 5 Republicans in the Senate, and he can't get anything done. So that's the real constraint on what I would call highly idiosyncratic actions of the sort that have been featured in the campaign.
Can I add one thing to that?
Very quickly, because we've got people making vigorous motions that we're done here. But
I was just going to say that the other constraint you might think about is WTO rules.
Right, absolutely.
But the thing about the WTO is that it does take several years to fix. So it is possible, I think, for a Trump administration to take an action which many might think would be in violation of WTO rules and get away with it in the sense that then another country could challenge us and it could go back and forth through dispute settlement and through appeals, and several years later we could be found in violation, and by that time the damage would have been done. So that's less of a constraint than one might think.
And also, it's very clear that the Trump administration or the people coming into it have signaled in the past that they're willing to test those constraints,
That's right.
Bob Lighthizer has talked about taking a much more aggressive attitude. Donald Trump during the campaign even said at one point, well, if they don't do what we say, then we should just pull out of the WTO, which of course would lead to a whole other seminar and discussion here at the Chicago Council. Folks, if you can just join me in thanking Gary Huffbauer, Thea Lee, and Phil Levy.